We all have this sort of sacred wound. Inside that wound is hidden our greatest awakening. And so we have to kind of go through that portal of forgiving ourselves, of unraveling our need to be loved and our need to find love in the outside world. And as we kind of unravel that, we come to the place where the love is inside us. We no longer need it reflected externally.
Welcome to The Art of Humanity. I'm your host, Jessica Ann. This is my podcast where you can listen for fresh perspectives with artists, leaders, authors, and your favorite entrepreneurs. You can explore creativity and consciousness, evolve your business with the art of humanity. Now, here's this week's episode. Hey guys, thank you so much for listening, as always, to the show. Today's show is brought to you by Audible. Here's the thing. I personally haven't consumed audiobooks up until recently because I preferred to use my Kindle. But audiobooks are now my main way to consume content. As listeners and readers of my book, Humanize Your Brand, know, I try to live the life of a minimalist. And I don't necessarily need or want more books. I like experiencing the brilliant insights of a book minus the hard copy. Well, if you're like me and love audiobooks, Audible is offering Art of Humanity listeners a free audiobook with a 30-day trial membership. Just go to www.audibletrial.com/artofhumanity and browse the selection of audio programs. You can download a title and start listening. It's really that easy. I love listening to audiobooks before bed. And the best part is that you can listen to audiobooks when you have Wi-Fi turned off, whether it's on a plane or right before bed and you don't want to be stimulated by social media. You can listen to an audiobook. I turn on airplane mode, put my eye mask on, and drift off to stories. And if I can offer a recommendation, I highly recommend downloading the book of my guest today. His name is Richard Rudd, and his book is called The Gene Keys. We'll uncover more of Richard's work in a bit. This is episode 35, and I've received such great feedback from launching season 4 of my podcast. I always appreciate your comments. I received this positive comment from Faris Koba on iTunes. He writes, I highly recommend Jessica's podcast, The Art of Humanity, for any marketing or PR manager looking to rediscover the human side of business. One of the most underappreciated elements of a marketer's job is finding what truly connects or resonates with the target audience, and Jessica's guests do a great job at providing perspective into how their unique experiences can plug into effective content and social marketing. Thank you, Faris, for that review. And if you like this podcast, leaving a 5-star review on iTunes would mean the world to me and help to gain momentum. It really only takes a few seconds, so if you could go over right now to iTunes and leave a review, I'll maybe even give you a shout out in my next episode. This season focuses on empowering the next paradigm of creativity. And one of the topics I'm exploring in this podcast and in my next book is creativity and consciousness. My guest today is Richard Rudd. I first got introduced to his work back in the summer of 2015. I bought his book and literally couldn't put it down. His work has transformed my lens on life because he unravels a concept that I intuitively knew, but he explains it with such profound depth and clarity. His work has unraveled so many layers of my heart. And this episode is really divine timing. The heart is being reborn on November 16th when Venus retrograde comes to a close. We'll have closure, clarity, and new beginnings with relationships, romances, and finances. We're starting over from a more honest place that's in true alignment this time. You see all of these cliches like open your heart. But I didn't really see it as a cliche or a saying. If your heart is closed and you read that, you're probably like, okay, yeah, I get it. Or people who live with strong shields over their hearts may regard vulnerability or sensitivity as weak. But to anyone else who's an empath like me, you may have had the experience of your heart truly breaking open. It's beautiful and terrifying. And after it happens, the world becomes a vibrant place, and you become more aware of the humanity that surrounds you. And there's truly no way to go back to who you were before. My guest's book, The Gene Keys, helped me during a time of profound inner transformation. And just a warning to those on the spiritual circus, so to speak, his work is not a quick fix solution. It's really a journey and a path. In order to move through the system and have it create a transformation, you need to stay with his work for some time. Abstract thinking and complex language are what defines us as a species. And as my listeners know who may follow me on Instagram, I'm a poet. and I sometimes share poetry on my Instagram. I've been exploring how words are almost like a portal into a different state of consciousness through poetry. And Richard and I actually dive into this concept a bit deeper in our interview. We also discuss how to turn the authority of our minds over to our hearts, why you don't have to be an intellectual to be a genius, why the future of human consciousness is going beyond the mind. We also talk about how the shadow side of humanity elevates our consciousness, why the gene keys is a tool to induce love, wisdom, and truth, how the few small differences in our DNA creates the richness of our differentiation. One of the most prophetic ideas in his book is why and how we're evolving into a Homo sanctus, or a blessed human, as the new genetic human vehicle, and why we must have a new body to house its new frequencies. Pretty trippy stuff. I'm so excited to bring you this interview. Here is my guest, Richard Rudd. Let's go to the show. Welcome to The Art of Humanity, where we explore creativity and consciousness to let you and your business evolve. Today, I'm so thrilled to have with me Richard Rudd. Richard is a teacher, mystic, and award-winning poet. His studies became synthesized in 2002 when he began to write and receive the Gene Keys, which took 7 years to complete. Today, Richard continues to study and teach the profound lessons contained in the Gene Keys. Richard, your book begins by introducing the reader to a fantastic possibility that humanity may be on the verge of a major shift in consciousness rooted in a new understanding of how our DNA operates, namely that it's programmed directly by the way we think and the way that we feel. This is a highly ambitious and sophisticated system for shaping one's destiny. Richard, I'm really not afraid to get deep here in this interview, but for listeners who may not be familiar with your work, what's the most simple way to explain the Gene Keys?
Well, the Gene Keys is a synthesis, and a synthesis is it means that it has to include everything. So what it does is it brings together through a kind of universal code. It brings together all different teachings and modalities, and it shows how, from like the mystic to the mundane, and it shows how they fit together as one kind of stream of insights and consciousness. So it's a way of kind of attaining a sense of deep purpose and unity in your life from kind of from understanding life at a much deeper level, so that life is much more mysterious than we think. The world that we see in every day, the minutiae that we focus on, actually there's a deep mystery hiding beneath our lives, and the Gene Keys is a way of taking you in directly into that mystery, so that it awakens a different part of us, a more illuminated part, a more joyous aspect of our nature, and that gives us a completely new perspective on our lives.
So, Richard, this means you're almost ushering in a new consciousness through your work. How did the Gene Keys come to you, and how has it shaped your consciousness?
It came to me, well, it's a sort of series of experiences over the course of my life, with a few large experiences thrown in. So back in my 20s, my late 20s, I suppose before my late 20s even, I had inklings. I used to wander around. I was a real wanderer in nature, and I was one of those strange boys that sort of wandered off a lot, and so would wander into the woods and the trees and the fields and things. And I would have, really powerful moments of transport, of kind of memory, in which I would just go into sort of ecstasy. And it was a secret thing that I kept to myself, and it was why I would keep sneaking off. Because I wanted to experience this feeling, this cellular memory of a deeper part of who I was. But then later in life, I had a big experience in which I sort of saw through the veil, if you like, of our everyday lives, what I was alluding to earlier. And in that experience, which was 3 days, 3 nights, and it was a spontaneous experience. It wasn't precipitated by any drugs or kind of technique or any yoga or anything like that. It just happened, and in that experience, I was shocked right to the core of who I was, but shocked in a good way. And then after that experience, I started to my life took a different direction. Instead of going into the sort of I was going to go into the wine business because that was my family business, but I didn't go in that direction. I went off in search of understanding around the world, and that began this sort of spiritual search in which I gathered more and more information and more wisdom from different people and modalities, like many of us seeking. And then I started to this jigsaw puzzle started to come together inside me, and that then emerged later as the Gene Keys. And when I wrote the book, that was the sort of the first kind of embodying of this wisdom that I had sort of come across, that had kind of ignited inside me. A sort of natural wisdom in terms of, when I say wisdom, I'm not claiming I'm wise. I'm just saying wisdom in terms of we all have wisdom in our bodies, actually in the cells of our DNA, in who we are. And that wisdom is not just about being intelligent. It's about kind of being open and loving and compassionate and a much, much better, higher version of ourselves than most of us have ever believed possible. So that's kind of how it's been a bit like assembling a jigsaw puzzle. And I'm still assembling it. So
you spent 3 days and 3 nights in a state of higher consciousness. And this state of higher consciousness, from what I understand, it's usually repressed in our DNA. So take me back to what was going on. Can you walk us through like the day that you woke up on the first of those 3 days? Did you know what you were experiencing at the time, and how did you come to terms with these moments of ecstasy that you experienced?
Well, I think actually it was the sort of moments of ecstasy in my earlier childhood that prepared me for that experience, which was, I would say, beyond ecstasy. It was a sort of a state of illumination, and very hard to describe. And I was alive with light. I was filled with light. I was this awesome being, but it wasn't me, Richard Rudd. It was just this huge being that filled me. It was being itself, if you like, and it almost took control of my mind. It sort of felt like that. It wasn't like an outside force, but my mind started to operate in a very different way, and it started to see things and remember things. And perhaps that's the best way to describe it. It was like a memory. It was a deep memory of this is what we are. We are this incredible being that is connected to all other beings, that is not even separate from other beings. And so, yeah, that was a huge, that shocked me deep down to the core of who I was. And then after that experience came to an end, and I returned to the sort of ordinary waking reality that most of us inhabit, then it took a long time to integrate that experience. It took a good sort of many years to kind of bring that down to earth and make sense of what had happened. And luckily I had some other sort of experience that echoed it, sort of echoes of it. So it sort of stayed alive in me. I think if I just had one experience and then it just shut down, I probably would have just kind of forgotten about it and carried on.
You would have gone into your family's wine business. Possibly,
yeah, which wouldn't have been a bad thing, but it just would have been a different destiny.
Your work really defies language because it really helps, as I'm reading your work and experiencing your work, it's like a transmission. And I first, as I was mentioning to you earlier, I first came across your work about 3 years ago. And since then, it's really unraveled so many layers of my experience in my heart. And it's just this like beautiful, slow unraveling that, gosh, it's just, to anyone listening that hasn't read Gene Keys, I highly recommend it. Your work really turns something that I've been grappling with over the past few years, how to turn the authority of our minds over into our hearts. And, it really is at the forefront of the next phase of human consciousness because you don't have to be an intellectual to be a genius. The new definition of a genius today is really someone that can get out of the mind and live through the heart.
Have we reached a saturation point with our human minds? And why do you feel that the future of human consciousness is going beyond the mind?
I would say that we are kind of at the apex, at the peak of our mental development as a species. We've been in this epoch where we've developed our mind in terms of the logical mind to the sort of peak of it. So we've really got to a place now where logic almost turns back on itself through like quantum understanding. And so we're really grappling with, the mind has really sort of reached, other than our technology, which goes on growing, but that's one element. But the actual grappling with the big questions of infinity and eternity and existence and all of that has almost gone as far as it can before it starts to move into paradox, paradox is where you have to go beyond the mind, because the logical mind, that is. So you have to move into a higher dimension to understand paradox. And that higher dimension is quite rightly what you referred to as the dimension of the heart or the soul or the higher mind, or the causal plane. People have all kinds of names for that. But it's a high dimensional understanding of the cosmos. But it does, that's the Gene Keys is about making that next step into, using the mind, but in a higher capacity. It's almost like the mind sees through the heart, and the mind and the heart, or the mind and the emotions at their highest peak they work together. And for me, that's what genius is. It's when the mind and the heart come into absolute harmony, and then but you transcend both in a way. So you transcend your emotions, and you transcend your feelings, and you transcend your logic, and then you move into a higher way of understanding things, because you understand them, as you said, through this capacity of genius, because you understand where things are interconnected. And so Gene Keys is about preparing people. All the synthesis and the work with the Gene Keys wisdom is about helping people kind of raise the frequency of what I call raise the frequency of their body, of their DNA, of their emotions, of their thinking, in order that they can kind of begin to have breakthroughs into this higher way of understanding, which is more akin to remembering, actually. It's a cellular remembering of something beyond ourselves. And it's something that the mystics and the teachers and masters have always spoken of for thousands of years. So it's not new. Gene Keys is a new approach for a new generation, but it's not a new understanding.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I love the way that you phrase that. It's a cellular remembering that really has been with us through all of time. And I love how you explain that it is a paradox, because in order to kind of soften and deepen into the heart, you kind of have to trust that with your head. Otherwise, you'll go crazy. You'll be an emotional mess, kind of. Or at least when I was going through this about, 3 years ago, it was an interesting time in my life. And as I was reading it, I was just, it really allowed me to accept the unraveling of the heart that, as you say, it's a natural process and a natural progression, and trust it. And I needed that paradox. Truth is always found in paradox. And if I didn't know that it was okay in my mind, I wouldn't have felt safe, so to speak, to surrender into the beautiful magic of the heart. And you mentioned that it's a way to kind of transcend emotions and logic and to move beyond the mind. So how do you begin to explain this to listeners out there who, may be in the logic and they're listening to this and they're like very skeptical and they're like, wait, this doesn't really add up in my mind. And they're listening with a sense of skepticism. How do you begin to explain this process or this path of illumination to the skeptics out there?
I guess I might talk about something like relationships, which we all struggle with in some way, most of us, unless we're very, very, very fortunate. But usually relationships provide us with a real challenge, and the kind of path of kind of moving towards wisdom through understanding our relationships is a pathway of kind of self-forgiveness and self-healing. And that there's nothing there's no need to be skeptical about any of that, because that is that's real. That to feel love and to be able to forgive and to be able to get on better with the people around you is actually a very practical set of things to learn. It will make your job, your business better. It will improve your relationships with your family, with your friends, with strangers at all levels of being. So learning to kind of see through your heart and soften into your heart is the first step, really, for most of us. And what happens is as you're learning that, and in Gene Keys it sort of teaches that. It teaches that in a very gentle way and quite a subtle way. And in doing that, it starts to kind of open you up, because when your heart starts to open up a little bit more and a bit more regularly, that's when your mind starts to soften as well. Your mind starts to open, because a very intellectual, skeptical mind is a mind that's probably a little bit rigid, and so that's connected to the heart. So as the heart softens, the mind opens, and as the mind opens, it opens to more possibilities, and as more possibilities kind of open up to us, then we begin to see more and understand more, and we realize how deeply connected the mind and the heart actually are. And most intellectuals or skeptics are kind of, at some level, that is their great challenge, is to see the connection between heart and mind. And so I love to challenge skeptics in that way, and I'll challenge them in a very human way and say, let's, because I'm not going to battle against the intellect. That's there's people with much greater intellects than me out there, but you can't really battle the heart. I mean, no one says no to love. So that's where I would steer the conversation.
Absolutely. You can't say no to love. You can question someone else's intellect, but you can't question the integrity of their heart. And this is something that, as you mentioned, the mystics have spoken of for centuries. And you actually bring in the teachings of ancient work into your Gene Keys. You integrate the I Ching, which is a Chinese methodology, with another program called the Human Design. And then you've made this Gene Key under illumination, I guess I could call it, your own. And can you explain the process of how you kind of used your mind? You had to use your mind to create the Gene Keys. At the same time, I'm sure it was a transmission. It was as you were creating it, but you had to kind of have the initial foundation of these ancient teachings in you to be able to build upon it, to bring this modern approach to human consciousness. So can you explain what that was like to combine and fuse these ancient teachings and integrate it into this new work of yours?
Yeah, I think so. I'll do my best. I think, it's like all the teachings from the sciences to the kind of mystic arts are basically like a toolbox, So it depends on where you want to go. You can pick up certain tools, and then when you bring them together, you can see how many of those tools all have the similar root. And that's been my interest, is like seeing this. It's not so much about having them all have to perfectly fit together, but it's showing how they have the same root. And that's what was of so much interest to me, is looking into, for instance, mythologies around the world and seeing how they all have a similar root, and how, certain, when you even look in through the sciences, you get to see how the kind of modalities of science all they point to similar geometries. And so when you start to look at things together, when you start to look not only through one lens, that's when things grow. So if you're a biologist, then if you also happen to be an expert, a musician, and you understand sacred geometry, you'll begin to see the connections between the things you've learned in biology are also there in music, and they're also the same principles in architecture or in life forms or in many different things. And you'll see them in the heavens, and you'll see them in DNA, and you'll see them all over the place, and you'll see the same principles. So essentially, as I've kind of gone through my intuitive journey of understanding and bringing together gene keys, I've spontaneously picked up the tools and the teachings and the scientific angles and approaches that I've needed. And I'm by no means am I a scientist. I'm much more a poet, in a way. Then I've started to integrate a lot of different approaches together. As you mentioned, human design was one, which is a kind of slightly esoteric system, and I went very deep into that because that's a synthesizing system, bringing together things. But then I wanted to go further. I keep wanting to go further and bring in more. It wasn't really something I consciously created or put together. It was just about seeing there's a greater synthesis. There's an even wider way of seeing something. And that, when I found something that was broad enough to contain the state of illumination that happened to me, then I was happy finally. And even with the gene keys, I would caution people. I'd say, look, these are just teachings. These are just my kind of tinkerings in the toolbox. And they're not the thing itself, but they point to the thing, and they can take you towards the thing itself. And the thing itself, of course, is love and wisdom and truth. But so all the tools are just the tools, but they kind of guide you towards the truth. Don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, you use the gene keys as a tool to further, the current state of our human consciousness, based on, some of the esoteric concepts from back in the day. The I Ching is the book of changes. Some of these concepts are really based in myth, and they unravel, our layers based on the challenges that we may face. It's not always the good times. It's not always the rainbows and the unicorns. It's kind of seeing how every moment of our life, even the challenges, are here to help us guide that path. So to dive in deeper, there are 3 parts to the gene keys, and one of them is like the shadow side to humanity. And that is kind of the foundation from which to continue to elevate our consciousness. So how integral is that shadow side to our humanity to be able to grow and evolve?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Jessica. It's that is actually, gene keys is one of the deepest kind of systems I know of that to explore the shadow, what Jung called the shadow archetypes of human consciousness, the dark side, if you like. And so through these 64 gene keys, which are derived from the I Ching, which are basically archetypes, you can see the variations of the shadow and if you look down the spectrum of consciousness, as I call it, if you look down all these different words, what you're seeing is like if I give an example, like the shadow of conflict, which is deeply embedded in every human being and in every society, in every culture, there's this conflict that we have because we have an inner conflict, and we express that externally in our relationships, and we express it through our gene pools, through war or through terrorism or whatever it is. You get to see that these patterns are all kind of in us, they're part of our humanity. And so the first step is to begin to see it. It's like Buddha, one of his fundamental teaching, which made people very uncomfortable, is that all life is suffering. And it's like a real one-liner. And Gene Keys is the same. It's like, look, you have to begin with the shadow. We are all suffering. We have this pattern, this paradigm deeply embedded in our conscious that runs us. And we have to see it and understand it. And then we can begin to unlock some of the secrets that are hidden inside it. In Gene Keys, the core saying is every shadow contains a gift. So inside every shadow is a gift hiding, but it takes some courage to dig into those shadows. So Gene Keys allows you to see your personalized shadows, the issues that have dogged you in this life. You could say that's your karma, or your particular struggle, and where it comes from, and what it is. And if you understand it really well, and the Gene Keys help you see that, then you begin to realize that actually you can forgive yourself that, or you can transcend it. You can move on. There are ways through deep acceptance of that you can change it. It can actually change, it can transform inside you. And what it transforms into is it transforms into a gift, which is an extraordinary thing. But it's actually in all our mythologies, right? It's embedded in all our movies and everything. Like something that's very negative actually ends up becoming something marvelous in the end. But you have to go through this incredible journey, to transform that suffering. And then it becomes this sort of reconstitution, this new higher kind of life. So yes, Gene Keys begins with the shadow. It takes courage in that sense. It's gritty in that sense. It's not a kind of big fluffy, as you said, new age system. It really, you have to dig into the darkness inside yourself and see it, and on a daily basis, and work with it. And then you begin to soften, and then it begins to kind of heal inside you, and you begin to find wholeness. And that's when it turns into its gift, and even eventually into something even more marvelous, which I call the Siddhi, which is our very highest, more miraculous potential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And anyone can go and take a test. It's on genekeys.com. And you can learn more about what you like to describe it as a hologenetic profile, which details, everything from that shadow up to the Siddhi, the gift. So you'll be able to look into your profile to be able to see kind of your shadow based on the time and place of your birth. And then be able to evolve your, whether you call them transgressions or your shadow side of how you see the world into this beautiful gift. And wow, it is quite a journey. I went and I took that test, and as I was reading through my own profile, I was just curious about, there are so many, there's 64 of these keys. And I'm curious as to, when you look at humanity as a whole, and everyone has, the dark and the light in them, how common are we all when it comes down to it?
Mm-hmm.
We're all going through different challenges, and we have different lifestyles and experiences. But when you kind of look at the whole of humanity from almost an aerial view of looking at the earth, how common do you see us all, Richard?
We're very similar, actually. That it's like it's the truth of DNA. Like our DNA is incredibly similar. It's just a few things different in each one. But those few differences actually create the kind of the richness of our differences, of our differentiation. And so, yeah, it's the same when you look at your profile. You may have an identical profile as someone else, but your experience of that profile is not the same. See, the profile isn't like, it's not describing your biology. It's describing your journey in life. So two people can have an identical looking journey, but because they're very different people in terms of they live in different places, they were born in different places, they have different families, they have different influences around them, those journeys will follow the similar archetypal patterns, but they'll be very, very different expressions. So yeah, it's both, they're very unique, but your profile also shows you the specific journey of unraveling that you're here to follow. And that kind of has deep resonance, as it tends to for individuals when they look at them and they work with them. And as you said, it's a very deep process. It's not, Gene Keys is not a kind of one of those quick fix systems at all. It takes commitment, and it's a journey, it's a path. You can step slowly in and kind of get little bites at the beginning, but in order to really move through the system and have it really help you and create a transformation in your life, you need to stay with it for some time.
Yeah, I mean, I found it 3 years ago, and I feel like as I'm seeing it now, I'm just beginning to fully understand, even through a new, unique lens of how I understood the Gene Keys even 3 years ago. So it's just so magnificently huge in the scope of the understandings that you're going to get from this work. And it really illuminates the human journey in a way that I've never explored before. It's something that it's so profound in a way that, there's just no words. I keep trying to form words to it. And it's just really like a poetic experience to existence.
Yeah, I have the same challenge.
Well, you do a very good job of communicating it. You're very poetic in your style and approach. And something that you've mentioned a little bit earlier on is that, we've reached the apex of our peak of our human potential. And it brings me into one of the most unique and interesting keys that I read was the 55th gene key, which describes genetic mutation. And you describe how humanity is due for one of these genetic leaps. And I actually mentioned this in my book. I always forget that I referred to you in my book, Humanize Your Brand, when it came out 3 years ago. And it talks about how we're evolving into a Homo sanctus, or a blessed human, and it's the new genetic human vehicle. We must have a new body to house these new frequencies. I'm really curious how to learn more about this concept. It's really the most thought-provoking and heart-expanding gene key that I've come across. Can you illuminate us on this gene key?
Yeah, it's a very prophetic part of the gene keys. And when I wrote the book, or when the book wrote itself, that gene key kind of, when I wrote it was sort of 5 times longer than any of the others. It just came out with this whole stream and I couldn't hold it back. And it's the one that's about freedom. It's journey of the victim to freedom. So it is universal to all of us, but it seems to be a kind of linchpin in our DNA and who we are as an archetype. So there's some aspect of it that I understood as changing inside us. It talks of a change, a cellular change, a mutation in our DNA. And that happens from time to time in evolution, and not just in humans, but in all species we're always mutating, but a kind of transmutation, which is like a set of mutations that occurs quite quickly, that causes almost a branch in the species. That's a rarer event, but it has happened in the past. It will probably continue to happen. It's happened many times. That's my understanding. So something like that is what the 55th gene key is pointing towards, and it's very prophetic in terms of it's quite an out there teaching. If you read that gene key, and it's available online on my shop on the sort of in the book area, so you can actually download the PDF and read it. If you go into the website, you'll find all these things. There's a lot of free resources. So yeah, it talks of this, as you said, this change in our species, and I don't see it as something that will kind of come overnight. I think it's something that will be rolling out over time, and it will begin to, I think it probably already is, divide us into 2 different types of human, an old form and a new form. And, I think that over time the body of the new form will begin to change in order to kind of house a different kind of awareness system. And because this is what happened, when I had this exalted state of consciousness, and when I've experienced those states after that, the nervous system has to really expand in order to kind of contain those higher frequencies, because they really are. It's like you're allowing more voltage into your body. I'm sure you've had these experiences. I'm sure many of the listeners have had kind of some kind of experience similar, and it can fry you if you're not prepared. All right, so the nervous system has to kind of really be able to handle it. In order to live with that, we need a new kind of body, and I think that's going to have to evolve over time. That's what the 55th gene key talks about: a new kind of human coming, in order that it can house, new biology can house those frequencies, and that the solar plexus system, where the shadow is transmuted, that is where the kind of all the changes are primarily kind of rooted, because it's in the belly, it's in the navel, it's in in our core that something new is awakening. So yeah, a lot of the 50th gene keys is about that transmutation in our species, and it is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, I would have to agree. I mean, you really do need a different body to house all that energy. Anyone out there, if you're not familiar with like Kundalini awakening or any of what we're talking about, you really can't quite explain it with words, but it's like you said, it like fries your system. It's this spark inside of you at the base of your spine that kind of rises along your spinal cord, and it runs throughout your nervous system, so that and it can be a really, really empowering thing, and it can be a really scary thing depending on what you know about it at the time, and as you're undergoing this kind of transformation. I'm curious, on a very tactical level, what do these new humans look like? Do they look different? You mentioned that there's going to be two different humans on this earth together. And based on kind of what you downloaded in your experience, do these new humans look any different? Do they act any different? What goes through, their minds and their bodies as they're transforming?
Well, I don't really know what they look like. They look different. I have some intuitions about that, but I don't really know. What I do know is the kind of the mythology of the 55th gene key that describes it is all based on the allegory that sits in that gene key is the dragonfly, as you probably know, and the life of the dragonfly. And the dragonfly lives as an underwater creature for 2 or 3 years before a nymph is called, before it mutates, and so it's a predator, and it doesn't know that it's going to become a dragonfly. It has no idea. It's just living its life as an underwater predator, and then one day it finds a stalk of grass and it does something it's never done before. It clings to that stalk and it starts to move up towards the sunshine, and it leaves the environment of the water, and it's never done that before, and it goes up into the light. And the moment it's hanging on the stalk of grass with the wind blowing it, and the moment that it gets out of the water, it starts to mutate because the sun starts to have this effect on it, and there's some gene inside it, some genetic transmutation that just triggers that whole event, and then the thorax starts to uncurl and unfold, and its back splits open, and this new creature comes out, and the wings come out, and then a puff of wind pushes it up into the air, and it takes to the air, and it's this incredible dragon-like, iridescent kind of flying creature that's utterly different from the creature it was for 2-3 years.
Yeah.
And so we can't really fully comprehend what we are going to become because it's so far beyond our understanding. We may have had sneak previews, so our awareness will be completely different. Our awareness is beyond emotional awareness. So if you were born into that state, let's say you were a child, then as a child you'd be completely different. You'd have a completely different energy about you. I imagine there would be a calmness to you that would have an effect on your entire environment. It's like a great teacher or a great master. There's a silence around them. There's a peacefulness around them. It's almost not possible to kind of stir them, and that doesn't mean they're not emotional or they're not passionate or any of those things. It just means that there's a certain stillness to their core so that they can't get pulled into your whatever it is you might want to pull them into.
They don't get triggered as easily.
No, they don't get triggered. They don't get triggered at all.
Yeah.
Because their awareness is resting outside of that kind of illusion of time and space and the drama. They know they are not this being, this separate being. And so there's a completely different view from inside that kind of a vehicle, and therefore there's a peacefulness, and there's a life, and it may contain all kinds of challenges and things. It has its own destiny and karma and all that, but a very different kind of person, a very different kind of human exists, and one that potentially has a huge effect on the people around them. Positive effect, sometimes a stirring effect for sure, a provocative effect, because peace can be very provocative, and love can be very provocative to the shadow. The shadow is not comfortable around that kind of energy field. And so there may be a stirring up as these new kind of beings come into the world. So it's kind of an exciting concept, really.
Super. It's groundbreaking. And, it's the old model is, our attitude to life is what programs our DNA and shapes our life. And that's kind of the approach we've been using. But this new model is completely different, and it puts consciousness first. It's your consciousness that creates the reality. And this is something that I can nerd out over for hours. I love talking about this stuff. So, when you put your consciousness first, it's all about your awareness of your own self that really creates the external reality. Is that kind of how your, teachings line up with this new paradigm?
In a way, yes. And I mean, I might change the language a bit and say, well, that, there's not even a your consciousness, there is just consciousness itself, moving through you, breathing, seeing through you, and you are in a state of surrender to that. And so the view that you see is so different from the one that we see, where we're attached to, the form that we're in, and we have these attachments to the way we think and the way we see things, and through our senses, the way we experience the world. I mean, this might be a bit far out for some of the listeners, but it's literally that this is what I've understood, is that we live in a world that is absolutely a figment of our imagination. It is so not what we see is so not the truth. To a very deep level. So literally everything around us is a program. It's like we're in a computer program. It's like we're in the Matrix, that film. Yeah. That is such a true film at that level. Everything is a program. Like a bird flying past your window is actually a little bit of programming code. And there is a code to that. There's a code to everything. That's what the gene keys are. The gene keys are the code of everything. So they unlock all the codes. That's why they're based in a kind of mathematical structure that is the same code that DNA is, 64 with 6 components in triplets, and that's what the I Ching consists of, and it's the code of the cosmos. It's everywhere. It's found in all natural systems. So it's the code of what the ancients call the Maya. The Maya is the illusion of the world around us. So when you can see through, when you break that code, that pattern, then you see life for what it is, truly, and you see everything interconnected, and you see kind of eternity. You're living in eternity, but we can't conceive that, right? In our normal mind, we're like, what the hell does that mean? What's this guy talking about? And I'm talking about something that the mind cannot comprehend. Right. How can the mind comprehend eternity? Mm-hmm. It can't. The heart can. The heart can say, I will love you forever. And it knows that that's true in that moment when it says that. So the heart is a much broader instrument to understand reality than the mind. But when the mind goes with the heart, then the mind becomes silent. And when the mind becomes silent and empty, then the mind can understand. But that takes, some time and a lot of heart opening for the mind to fall silent like that. Yeah. But that's, then we see reality for what it really is. And then we're, everything is just pure. There's nothing wrong with anything. Nothing. There's nothing that we would want to change about the world or our life or anything, because we only see the perfection of the cosmos. And that's our surrender.
Yeah, it's a higher grace surrounding us at all times. And, as you said, once we break that code, this awareness it's not even an awareness. It's a consciousness that breathes through you, and you become a part of this. I mean, I don't have all the answers. I'm not claiming I can experience this every day whatsoever. But, I've had tapped into this eternal truth throughout bits and pieces of my life, and it is beautiful. And it really is like you can tap into the code of the cosmos, and then it's like you see everything through the illusion of the Maya. And sacred, you mentioned sacred geometry a little bit earlier in the interview, and I'm curious kind of how important is sacred geometry to this unraveling and this illumination. And, can you explain a little bit of sacred geometry to the listeners? Because I find that it's magical and mysterious and beautiful, and it's a key component to this awakening.
Yeah, well, sacred geometry is, in a way, the unifying kind of teaching or aspect of all other modes of thinking and understanding. So you can take physics, and you could take music, as I mentioned earlier, or you could take sociology, or you could take mythology, or you could take any mode of thought and understanding. And sacred geometry is the linking bridge between all those things. And because it points to perfection. And sacred geometry isn't just like, it's not lines like as we understand geometry. That can be an aspect of it, because sacred geometry is about, interlocking. It's about where things interlock. So it's actually it's a two-dimensional way of looking at perfection. But to actually really understand sacred geometry, you have to enter beyond 2 dimensions. So you have to kind of feel it inside your body. And when we talked about these higher states, what happens is that you enter into the sacred geometry, and you're a part of it. You're a part of the pattern of perfection, and everything is orchestrated and choreographed in time and space perfectly within that geometry. So the geometry is alive. It's moving. It's fractal. It's as many curves as it is. In fact, it's all curves. There's no straight lines in true sacred geometry, because everything is, you see a straight line, but actually it's curving if you follow it. It has to curve, and that curve continues. And, everything is curves. Everything is the feminine in that sense. So it is a level of consciousness that you enter into. And when we talk, I talk about these siddhis, these higher states, and that's why I would say to people, look, what's a little bit unique about Gene Keys is when you look at your profile, you actually can look at the profile of your enlightened self. And I don't know any other system that gives you that. It shows you your siddhis. It shows you the words that correspond to your fully realized consciousness. So it shows you your absolute awakened self, and it gives you these words that show that. And then those words are portals into those experiences, whether the word is ecstasy, or whether the word is devotion, or whether it's veneration, or whether it is, grace. Any one of these words, they're all the same experience, but they're a slightly different lens on the higher truth. This is why when you listen to 2 different great teachers or enlightened teachers, they may appear to say opposite things, because the same truth is resonant underneath, but the style that they're using, the approach, is different. That's because the vehicles are slightly different. The lenses are slightly different, but the experience underneath isn't different. It's a really amazing thing is to be able to look at to really contemplate your highest manifestation possible, and to kind of hold that as a reality in your everyday life is what begins to change your reality.
Yeah, for sure. And there are different words that explain this process. I'm looking at my gene key, and it has deep, deep resonance for me. It's purity. And I just love that word, purity. And it's really unique and interesting to dive in deeper and just see, as an example, of how you word it, listeners may be able to use this just to tap into the wisdom of that word, because it's profound, and it's, you use that word kind of as a framework to go even deeper into a wordless wonder in a way. So it's really cool.
Yeah, it's nice. I like that expression you used, the wisdom of that word, because there is there are wisdom in those words. They are they're stepping stones into states and stages of consciousness. Yeah, that's exactly what they are. Portals.
Portals, yes. Into the void and then back again.
Yeah.
Something you mentioned about the feminine state of our being, and you touch upon this a little bit later on in your work if you move through the process of the gene keys. The feminine process is a huge part of the awakening experience, because you are, the heart and the emotions and feelings are so feminine in their approach to life. And, you have this process called the Venus sequence, and it aligns with this feminine approach to our lives. And can you speak to the fact that, this modality or these tools that you are speaking about are kind of a little bit more, or a lot of, have a lot of feminine aspects to them? Is that the key component to moving forward?
It's one of them. I mean, it is a completely critical stage in any process of awakening, is the transformation of our emotional life, of our desire life. I mean, it's what the ancients called tantra, right? It's the transmutation of our desire, and that's what this Venus sequence is about. So when you if you explore your gene keys a little bit deeper, you'll come to your Venus sequence and you'll begin to see that there are codes and patterns built into you that were laid down at the point of conception, and those kind of codes are the codes of your suffering. And so as you begin to see how layered they are, and you begin to see through the layers and open up those layers, and you do that in a sequence, which is why it's called a sequence. So you unlock the sequence through your awareness of watching yourself and watching your patterns in your everyday life, and particularly in your relationships, because that's where they're the most alive. And then as you see yourself behaving in that way, you can begin to unthread those patterns that have been running your life, that have been ruining your life, you could say. And you can begin to kind of unthread the weave of that illusion that's been kind of keeping your heart defensive and closed and reactive and resentful and all those things, and begin to find openings inside your heart and inside your relationships, and finding forgiveness and just opening up these little doorways inside your heart, so that when you react and when you're provoked or you're triggered, you begin to see, oh, wow, there's a pattern at work in me that's not even my fault. And it's not actually anyone's fault, even though it might be tempting to think, well, it's my mum's fault or my dad or something that happened to me. There may be truth to that, and that has to be processed in some way. But actually, it was laid down at the point of a conception. We all have this sort of sacred wound, and inside that wound is hidden our greatest awakening. And so we have to kind of go through that portal of forgiving ourselves, of unraveling our kind of need to be loved and our need to find, love in the outside world. And as we kind of unravel that, we come to a place where the love is inside us. And then, the highest level of that Venus sequence is when we find the source of love inside us, the ocean of love inside us. And then once we find that well, we no longer need it reflected externally, and because we're literally being showered from inside ourselves with it. And that's a process over time that takes time of opening. And it is a very feminine process in that sense. It's not, when I say when we talk about feminine, it's not like, oh, that's only for women or anything. It's a feminine process because we have to move through the layers of wounding around our heart. And that takes a feminine approach, an approach of gentleness, of softness. That is not terrain for the mind. The mind needs to kind of yield and learn to soften and learn to see itself with clarity. But that is a very feminine aspect of the Gene Keys work, and it's very powerful and very practical. I always think like the feminine things are the most practical,
Yeah.
And it really works.
Oh, yeah, I can attest to that. And any of the male listeners out there who may not even understand what we're talking about, I would highly encourage listeners to check it out, genekeys.com. Thank you, Richard Rudd, for taking us through this portal. It's just been so beautiful and magical journey with you this past hour.
Thank you, Jessica. It's a real pleasure.
Is there anything else that listeners should know about your work or where they can find you online?
I think it's all there on genekeys.com, and I think they can just dive in and explore the synthesis there.
Yeah, and warning that it's a lifelong process, and it's a beautiful, magical experience. So thank you for bringing your work into this world, Richard.
Thank you, Jessica. It's an absolute pleasure.
You made it to the end of the podcast. This means the world to me, and I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to hop on over to my podcast website, artofhumanity.io, for show notes or past interviews. Or you can message me on social media. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. My name is Jessica Ann, and my handle starts with an I. It's at ITSJESSICANN. I'd love to hear from you and learn more about what you've learned from this episode, and I'll be sure to get in touch with you. If you really love this podcast, I'd highly appreciate it if you went on iTunes right now and left a review. It helps way more than you know. Let's get the Art of Humanity movement going. Thank you for listening. Until the next episode, evolve your business with the Art of Humanity. Listen, explore, evolve. I'm Jessica Ann.